If you walked into an ancient Egyptian home 3,000 years ago, you would smell it before you saw it. Not the incense, not the bread baking in a clay oven. Something worse, something rotting right under your feet. Because here's the part nobody tells you about the people who built the pyramids, mummified their pharaohs, and invented writing on paper. They lived on top of their own garbage. Not near it, not beside it, on top of it. Literally. Egyptian houses got taller over the centuries not because architecture improved, but because the trash pile underneath them kept rising year after year, and people just kept building new floors on top of the old filth instead of moving out. And that single disgusting habit is about to hand you the greatest detective story you've never heard. Because thousands of years later, that garbage didn't disappear. It got buried, sealed, and preserved by the driest desert on Earth, and when archaeologists dug it up, they didn't just find trash. They found the last honest fingerprints of an entire civilization. What people ate the night before they died. What letters they wrote and threw away. What lies they told each other. What their bathrooms actually looked like. Things the pharaohs never wanted you to know, sitting in a garbage heap the whole time. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this, you're never going to look at a trash can the same way again. Here's a question most people never think to ask. When you throw something away, where does away actually go? You probably don't know. Most of us don't. A truck comes, it disappears, and that's the end of it. We've outsourced away so completely that we've forgotten it's a place at all. Ancient Egypt had no such luxury. There was no truck, no landfill on the edge of town, no system. For most of Egyptian history, away simply didn't exist as a concept, and that forced people into one of two options: burn it or live with it. Most of the time, they lived with it. Picture a town like Deir el-Medina, the walled village near the Valley of the Kings, built specifically to house the workers who carved out the tombs of pharaohs. These weren't slaves, by the way, contrary to what a lot of us were taught. They were skilled, paid laborers, the ancient equivalent of a specialized construction crew, complete with strikes, sick days, and workplace complaints written down on broken pottery. And in this town, the trash just piled up. Broken pots, fish bones, onion skins, ash from cooking fires, old sandals with the soles worn through, bits of linen too torn to mend. All of it got swept out the door, dumped in the street, or tossed into an empty room of the house that nobody used anymore. Then something remarkable happened. When the pile got too high, they didn't remove it. They packed it down, laid a new mud brick floor directly over it, and kept living exactly as before, just a little higher up. Do that for a few centuries, and you get what archaeologists call a tell, an artificial hill made entirely of compressed human habitation and its debris. Layer after layer after layer, like the world's most disgusting cake. Some of these mounds in Egypt and the wider Middle East rise dozens of feet above the surrounding land, and every single foot of height represents years, sometimes centuries, of people simply refusing to deal with their own mess. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Those layers are in order. Bottom to top, oldest to newest, like the world's filthiest calendar. Dig straight down through a tell, and you're not just moving through dirt, you're moving backward through time, one garbage layer at a time. For a long time, archaeologists ignored all of this. They wanted gold. They wanted sarcophagi, jewelry, statues with unbroken noses. Garbage heaps were the boring stuff you shoveled through to get to the good part. Then, in the early 20th century, something changed the game entirely, and it happened at Deir el-Medina, in the trash itself. Buried in the rubbish of that workers' village, archaeologists found tens of thousands of small, broken pieces of pottery and limestone flakes, the ancient equivalent of scrap paper covered in handwriting. The Egyptians called them ostraca, and unlike the polished, formal inscriptions carved for eternity on temple walls, these were never meant to survive. They were meant to be thrown away, which is exactly why they told the truth. One ostracon is a worker complaining that his co-worker showed up drunk, again. Another is a tally of who missed work and why. Sick. His mother died. Brewing beer. Scorpion bit him. One is a love poem. One is a laundry list. One is a sketch, a crude, funny doodle of a cat serving a mouse, mocking the world upside down, probably drawn by someone bored out of their mind on a slow afternoon 3,000 years ago. None of this was supposed to last. This was the disposable, throwaway paperwork of ordinary people, and it survived by accident, buried in filth, while the grand monuments built to last forever have often told us far less about how people actually lived. That's the twist hiding inside this whole story. The things ancient Egyptians tried hardest to preserve: the temples, the tomb inscriptions, the carefully worded prayers were curated, written for an audience, written for legacy, sometimes written to flatter a king who was still very much alive and reading. But the trash? The trash didn't know it was being watched. The trash is the only part of the ancient record that never learned to lie. Once archaeologists figured this out, garbage heaps stopped being an obstacle and became the objective. Egyptologists have sifted through ancient rubbish piles and reconstructed, meal by meal, what different classes of people actually ate, not what temple records claimed they offered to the dead, but what real households were chewing on and spitting out. Fish bones from the Nile. Bread so gritty with sand and ground stone from the milling process that it wore people's teeth down to painful stumps by their 30s. Dental problems from bread are one of the most common ailments found in mummified remains. And we know this partly because the eroded millstones and the gritty crumbs ended up together in the same rubbish. Onion skins, date pits, melon rinds, beer residue crusted onto broken jars. Because in Egypt, beer wasn't a luxury, it was practically a food group. Thick, nutritious, and safer to drink than the Nile water itself. Take medicine. Broken linen wrappings, tossed aside after treating wounds, still carry traces of the substances Egyptian healers packed into cuts. Honey, which we now know has genuine antibacterial properties, and moldy bread, which may have delivered a primitive, accidental dose of something antibiotic-like, centuries before anyone understood what a microbe even was. Nobody was trying to leave a lesson for the future. It was just what got thrown out after a doctor's visit that happened to survive. Take the darker side. Some rubbish deposits near embalming workshops are stacked with the discarded materials of mummification: used linen, spent natron salt, broken pots that once held resin. Whole industries, whole supply chains, reconstructed from what was thrown out the back door when the job was finished. Even the deeply sacred business of preparing someone for eternity generated a very unglamorous pile of waste out back, because it turns out that's true of practically everything humans have ever done in any era. And take the closest thing ancient Egypt had to a bathroom. Wealthier homes sometimes had a dedicated latrine, a wooden or limestone seat positioned over a bowl of sand or a removable pot, which a servant would then have to empty. That waste, along with everyday household trash, in many towns simply ended up dumped into the streets or the nearest canal. Some cities smelled about how you'd expect a place with no sewage system and a hot climate to smell. Archaeologists have actually studied preserved fecal matter from Egyptian latrines and mummies, a field with the wonderfully blunt name paleoparasitology, and found evidence of parasites like tapeworm and schistosomiasis, a nasty flatworm infection you pick up from wading in contaminated water. The Nile that gave Egypt its civilization was, at the same time, quietly making its people sick, and we know the details because of what they left behind in the waste. But here's where the story bends in a direction that might genuinely surprise you. As messy as Egyptian trash disposal often was, ancient Egyptians were, in some ways, better recyclers than we are. They had no choice. Materials were expensive. Labor was expensive. Nothing got made without real effort, so almost nothing got discarded if it still had a second use in it. Broken pottery didn't just get abandoned, it became those ostraca we already talked about, reused as scrap material for writing, sketching, and record-keeping, because good writing surfaces were costly and broken pots were free. Old linen wrappings were torn into strips and repurposed as bandages, or even recycled into a crude form of paper-making adjacent material. Worn-out tools were melted down and reforged. Broken furniture became firewood. Even human hair, swept from barbershop floors, has turned up used as stuffing in cushions and in wig-making workshops. Wealthier households employed servants specifically to sort and manage waste, extracting anything reusable before the rest was dumped or burned. In some towns, entire informal economies grew up around picking through refuse for scraps of metal, cloth, or fuel, a version of scavenging and resale that would look eerily familiar to anyone who's studied waste economies in modern cities today. The idea of an informal recycling sector isn't new. Ancient Egypt basically invented it out of pure necessity, for 1,000 years before anyone called it sustainability. So the picture that emerges isn't quite as simple as ancient people were filthy and careless. It's stranger and more human than that. They were resourceful about the things that were valuable and completely careless about the things that weren't, which, if you're being honest, is exactly the same calculation most of us make today. We recycle the aluminum can. We don't think twice about the fifth plastic bag. So let's go back to where we started, that smell under the floorboards, that rising mound of ancient filth that a family just kept building new rooms on top of, generation after generation. At the time, it must have seemed like nothing. Just the ordinary, unremarkable, faintly embarrassing byproduct of being alive. Nobody in Deir el Medina looked at a shattered beer jar or a used bandage or a child's broken toy and thought, "This will matter someday." They threw it in the corner and moved on with their lives, the same way you'll throw away a grocery receipt today without a second thought. But that's exactly the point, and it's the reason this story sticks with people long after they hear it. The objects we treasure and preserve on purpose tell us what a civilization wanted to be remembered for. The objects we throw away without thinking tell us what a civilization actually was. Temple walls tell you what the pharaoh wanted carved into eternity. A trash heap tells you what people ate for dinner, what diseases they suffered through, what jokes made them laugh, who they were angry at, and what parts of daily survival they never expected anyone to care about, ever. 3,000 years from now, if anyone digs through what we're leaving behind, the landfills, the microplastics, the buried server farms, the mountains of packaging, they won't learn who we claim to be from our monuments and our social media posts. They'll learn who we actually were from what we threw away without a second thought. Which raises the only question worth sitting with as this ends. If archaeologists dug through your trash tomorrow, 3,000 years from now, what would it say about you? Subscribe for more. History's weirder than they taught you.